series we've been working through over the last couple of weeks called Rebuild. It's been a look through the book of Nehemiah, and there's so much that we've covered. We've got a couple of gaps that we're going to fill in Nehemiah 10, and then we're going to jump to Nehemiah 13. So kind of keeping both of those together, Nehemiah 10 and 13. Here's some of the quick facts for the book of Nehemiah that we'll throw up on the screen for you. The first one, just as we start to play catch up, is that the Babylonian exile, this period in human history, occurred around the year 600 BC. There were many nations that were included of it, but part of our study in church history is the reason why the nation of Israel was included. And so then, about 70 years after that, there's a ruler named Cyrus who made this decree that everybody who'd been pulled from their country and was living in exile, they were now able to return home, so he sends them back there. In Jerusalem specifically, they start rebuilding the temple around 516 BC. If you know your Bible, just the book before this is known as Ezra. Ezra was one of the first exiles to return, and he was charged with building the temple. And then as we fast forward to the book of Nehemiah, around 445 BC, Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes, returns back to Israel, and part of his purpose in rebuilding was to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And we've covered a lot of content up to this point, but it's always fun in moments where we can look back to kind of say, where have we come from and where are we going to? So here's the entire book that we've looked at so far, and if this is your first week, this also helps you catch up to today. So in Nehemiah chapter 1, we hear about the state of Jerusalem. This is this moment where reports come back to Nehemiah while he's the cupbearer, and it starts to lead him to pray and to ask, what is God doing and what would God use me for, and how could I help to be a part of this rebuilding effort? In Nehemiah 2, those prayers are fulfilled as he gets an opportunity to say to the king, I'd love to return, I'd love to rebuild, I'll be gone for 12 years and you can pay for all of it, which he did. In Nehemiah 3, the rebuilding actually begins, and so that's one of the first lists that we read, and it said that this person built here, and this person built there, and this person built there. And one of the things that came up from it is the majority of people, they walked outside of their house and started to rebuild there. And all rebuilding efforts often begin with us, and they start right in front of us. We don't have to go to a distant land to do so. If we start rebuilding where we are, that God will use our rebuilding efforts there. In Nehemiah 4, it's this first introduction to anytime you do a good thing, there's going to be people who don't want good things to be done because that's just the way the planet works. And so in Nehemiah 4, we're introduced to Sanballat and Tobiah, two primary antagonists against him and against the rebuilding efforts. And then we find at the end of that people started carrying trowels and swords, and there were people who were building and people who were defending. Good times had by all. In Nehemiah 5, as we started to read there, that once the rebuilding efforts happened and that a wall was halfway built, Nehemiah started to hear that there were people who were being oppressed on the inside, right? That they had returning from that, and when they returned, they didn't have jobs, but one of their cousins bought all of their land or indentured them into slavery. And so as Nehemiah heard of this, he was like, we need to stop the oppression that we're doing against ourselves and the oppression that's happening all around. So that was chapter 5. In chapter 6, we saw how that opposition continued, that it wasn't just good enough for threats or even random, horse ride-bys for it to be enough. As that opposition increased and they found opportunities to kill, that was where Nehemiah even increased the way that it was to be guarded against. And every good thing, it doesn't mean even that you'll stop having bad things happen initially. Usually with any good thing you pursue in your life, you're going to face opposition internally or potentially externally, and our diligence to be able to maintain our guard in that way. In Nehemiah 7, this was the second list that we read, and it was all of the peoples who had returned from exile, and there was a whole bunch of numbers involved in that, which is everybody's favorite portion of the Bible when we read it, and so we had kind of cruised our way through there. In Nehemiah 8, there was this return to worship and how they had reestablished, here's who we are as people, and here's the way that we're going to choose to live. In Nehemiah 9, that's where we had entered into this confession and repentance that was commissioned by the whole country, and how it wasn't just them repenting of their sins before or their own personal things, but they were looking back through their entire history and saying, here's where it began, here's where it got to, here's how it got really bad, but here's how you've brought us back. In the opening part of chapter 10, which we'll skip over because we read it before, we read the list of people who had signed the covenant and how they had recommitted themselves to God. And then in 11 and 12, Those were the parts where we read the people who had given their lives to return back to Jerusalem and to rebuild it, both the people, 1 in 10, who'd assigned themselves to live there, plus the Levites and the priests and all of that. So that catches us up to parts of today. So we've got a little bit of 10, and then we're going to jump to 13. Now, we've shared this verse, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 this week. If you're around here long enough, you're going to have this memorized by the time you leave here. Because what I believe is no matter where we find ourselves in the Bible, every aspect of it is good for you and I. It's good to encourage us and develop us and grow us, but it's also going to challenge us and correct us so that everything that God would ask us to do, we'd be equipped to do that. So if you're exploring faith or you're new to Jesus Church in the Bible, the best way for us to talk about what does it mean to follow is for us just to orient ourselves this way. And then it's also, if you've been around church for a long time, we're not going to grow out of our need to continue to point ourselves here to say, what would God be saying to us on this day? And so all of that to say, we'll take a collective deep breath. Anytime you reach an end point in your life, or you reach a goal, or you reach something you've been looking forward to, you always ask the question, now what? So the first time that really happens is when you graduate from high school. And maybe you answered the I know what I'm doing after high school question, or you graduated, you had all of the fun, you threw the hat, and you're like, now what am I going to do with my life? Right? And you might have been pressed by your parents to go get a job or go to college or go find something else to do. That would have been phase one. But if you went to college, you get done with college, and then you're like, now what? Or you go get your first job, and then you finally achieved it. You did all the interviews, you're working, and now what? Now you get your place and the thing that you've been going for. Now what? You start to date, or maybe you get married, and then as you return from your honeymoon, you get into your house and you're like, now what? You start to decide you're going to have kids, and you're like waiting for a kid to be born, and as a child enters onto the planet, you're holding that little baby in the hospital, and you're like, now what? And then you go home, and then as you've got all the swaddles and all the things, now what? And as the child starts to grow up, eventually you have this question where it's like, should we have another one of those? Or maybe we should not. Like you clearly, the Chandlers decided yes multiple times, but you have this part where you're like, now what? And even if we said, okay, we're done having kids now, right? 4 is enough. Like the planet agrees. We only fit in minivans. Like, okay. Then we have this question where it's like, now what? And then if you've been a parent, your kids have left the home, and now all of a sudden it's quiet. It's been noise for 20 years. And random like smells and things, and now you're like, it's just us. Now what? Or eventually as your relationship starts to carry its way forward, and maybe you're a person who's lost a spouse, or maybe you've lost a child, or you have these moments where it's like, now what? You are going to ask the question, now what? Through a lot of aspects of your life. And sometimes that question could be the place where you stall, and it's like, because I couldn't figure out what am I supposed to do, I'm just going to kind of sit here for a while and see what happens. And if you've noticed, if you've been in that, I'm just going to sit here and see what happens space, nothing ever happens. You just keep sitting there. And then eventually, you're either going to have to do something, or it's just going to all start to fade away. And so both Nehemiah 10 and 13 is this now what question for the people of Israel. Because they've returned back from exile, and they've returned back to Jerusalem just as God promised. They've rebuilt the walls and rebuilt the temple, and worship has been reestablished, and the covenant's been recommitted. So now what? Now that all the things that God said would be true are true, now what are we going to do? So if you've got your Bible, we're starting Nehemiah 10, verse 28. It's on page 406. If you don't have a Bible, there's one in the seat back in front of you. That's our gift to you. You could take that with you. If you just want to read there and follow along, that's great also. So Nehemiah 10, we'll start in verse 28. So after this big list, here's the people who had signed the covenant. Here's this. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who have separated themselves from the people of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their brothers and their nobles and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, and his rules and his statutes. We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. And if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day, and we will forego the crops of the 7th year and the exaction of every debt. We also take on ourselves the obligation to give yearly a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, the regular grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moons, the appointed feasts, the holy things, and the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel and for all the work of the house of our God. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people, have likewise cast lots for the wood offering to bring into the house of our God according to our fathers' houses, at times appointed year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all fruit of every tree year by year to the house of the Lord. Also bring to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of our God, the firstborns of our sons and of our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and of our flocks, and to bring the first of our dough and our contributions, the first of every tree, the wine and all the oil to the priest, to the chamber of the house of our God, and to bring the Levites the tithes from our ground, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all our towns where we labor. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithes, and the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. For the people of Israel and the sons of Levi shall bring the contribution of grain, wine, and oil to the chambers where the vessels of the sanctuary are, as well as the priests who minister, and the gatekeepers and the singers. We will not neglect the house of our God. So this is the covenant. This is the thing that's been reestablished. And so for weeks now, they've been having this moment where they've just been reading the early parts of the law just out loud. And at first it began where they read in the morning, then they read to midday, and then they started to read where a quarter of their day they spent reading and a quarter of their day spent worshiping. And through that process, just hearing like the word being read out loud to them, there was this moment where it was like, hey, we as a people are going to make a commitment. And then we would have to ask the question, what is the commitment that they're making? So if you've got a bulletin with you, you've got a blank for you, you could fill out this. The very first blank that we'll fill out today is this: define following. Define following. So for them, like, I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting or something and people are like, this is what we're going to do. Everybody say aye. And then you're like, wait, what are we signing up for here? Right? And we've had a moment, my wife and I had a conversation this morning where we signed one of our kids up for an activity. We thought it was going to be great. Everything about it going into it was like, this is going to be really easy, super simple. It's going to be great learning experience. And then we started to get all these subsequent emails about all these other meetings that we didn't know that we signed up for. And so we had this part of us that was like, man, if we knew on the front end all the meetings that we'd have, we might not have signed up for it, but they got us with like, look how easy it's going to be, and it's going to be fun, hooray. And this is also, here's where you signed on the line. Right now, if you've ever read the fine print of anything, you probably got one time, right? Where you were like, well, I didn't know that this is what that meant. And they're like, oh, it's in the terms and conditions. Oh, you mean the 95 pages that I'm supposed to read before I sign? You probably just scroll and sign now, right? Like, I don't know how many times where you've been reading online, you're like, can you just agree and accept the terms? You're like, I didn't even read the terms, accept and move on, because I'm ready for the pop-up window to disappear. But there are terms and conditions for everything. So here's this like little covenant part that they said, here's what we as a people are going to do. And where it starts to be this really long list, and we're like, I don't know if I'm going to read all of that. Very simply, they say, hey, we're entering into this covenant with God. And we recognize that if we say yes and if we follow, it's going to bring blessing to us. But if we say no and we neglect it, it's going to ultimately end up just like where we were. So we recognize us following God is going to be better than us not following God. So we say yes to that. They say that we're going to separate or we're going to remove ourselves from the peoples of the land. That even as we've been pulled back from exile, we recognize one of the things that got us in trouble the last time is we started keeping some bad company. So if we're going to be a holy, separate covenant people, we're going to keep ourselves as a holy, separate covenant people. We're not going to enter into marriage with the people of the land, because if I believe one way and she believes another way, that's probably not going to work out well in marriage. It's not going to work out well in parenting, so we're going to make the decision we're not going to enter into that. They says that we're not going to buy or sell or the Sabbath, that if God made something holy and sacred and set apart and asked us to rest, we're not going to pretend like we're not resting simply because we're buying worship stuff on Sunday. Right? So we're going to choose to honor the Sabbath. We're going to forego every 7 years. We're going to give all of those crops back. We're going to forgive every debt. We'll give a third of a shekel. We'll give a piece of money to ensure that what God is doing inside of the temple, the work is going to continue. And we'll bring the first of everything. We're going to make sure that that gets to God. That was them saying, this is our covenant. And there's aspects of that you and I, we can hear that and we can relate to. Because if you've ever had a moment where you became a Christian at a time where you could ask the questions, what do we do now? Or what now? It's interesting what happens when you've said yes to Jesus and all the next steps after. And you'll hear me say a lot, like my decision to say yes to Jesus was a hand that I raised in a service that someone invited me to the front and they prayed for me. And then I felt like I was in. But the question I was asking is like, now what? And there were plenty of moments where I would show up to something and someone would say, Justin, you can't do that anymore. I was like, well, why not? Like, I've been doing this my whole life. What do you mean I can't listen to this anymore? Like, that I shouldn't pursue that anymore? They're like, well, just listen to the lyrical content. Like, I know that you're obsessed with street culture, but you're not from the streets, actually. Like, let's not try to be hood rich, young blood. Let's just go ahead and let it lie, right? Like, who's wearing a V-neck sweater in the hood, Justin? No one is, right? So there's this moment where they start to see that, right? So they have this moment where it's like, hey, you're going to have to probably pull back from that. And it's like, well, what am I going to do with these like 12-inch subwoofers that are in the back of my truck and all of this bass that I'm dumping on the streets? Well, it's like, here's some Kirk Franklin. It's going to go well, right? So this is how it starts to play out, right? And then it's like, hey, this language that you've been familiar with in communicating, you probably shouldn't communicate like that anymore. That if the heart of what's coming out of you is like a love for God and a love for people, and you want love to be what comes out of you, you should probably ask the question, is this the most loving way to communicate? I'll tell you, learning how to talk different is probably the hardest thing to do. Right? Then when you start having this moment of here's just instinctually how I respond, I've told people all the time, one of the hardest things for me to stop using was some of the adjectives that I'd become familiar with. Right? To learn how to stop doing that. And so you start to see that this is the way that we as a covenant people ask. But if we don't ever ask the question, what does it mean to follow? We'll never be able to answer why. And so part of what I'm really excited about, even in this new chapter for Harbor Trinity, is we've introduced a number of ways for you to be able to answer the question, what does it mean to follow? So one of the very first ways is we started the Alpha course at the end of January. And if you're not familiar with Alpha, it's a series of films that answer the most basic questions of what it means to follow Jesus. Who is Jesus? Why did he die? How do we have faith? Why do we read the Bible? Why do we pray? How do we make the most of our life? And so we've had about 50 people attending every Wednesday. We start a brand new session on April 12th, which is the Wednesday after Easter. Now, there's some of you who are in this room that you're there on Wednesdays. We've already had our chat. I want you to come again. There's some of you who haven't been there, and I want you to come. And you may say, like, I did the Alpha course a long time ago. I did too, about 17 years ago. It's different than it was 17 years ago. I'd love for you to come. There's some of you who would say, I've been a Christian for so long, I don't need to answer those questions. I'd love for you to come because it's a brand new way to learn how to express your faith and to share your faith and to talk with other people about it. And there's some of you who are like, I have no idea how to answer any of those questions. I'd love for you to come too. And one of the best parts about it is when you sit at the table, everybody gets to share a meal together, which everybody loves food, right? Across the globe, that's true. So then you get to have food together, you get to talk about life and say, here's what's going on in my week. You get to have people who know you. And then you just get to have a really cool conversation about what it means to be a person who's of faith. So if you haven't been to Alpha yet, this is my greatest spiel. I want to see you April 12th on Wednesday when we start a new one. And I'll be your host. We'll have a great time. All right, so that's first. The second part about it would be that we have a new member course that's coming up the Tuesday before that. So on the 11th, we'll start a brand new member class here at Harbor Trinity. And you may not know this, but a part of how we're structurally set up is there's people who attend every weekend, and you and I are them. And then there are also people who have said, I want to make a commitment to be a part of Harbor Trinity, and I want that to be different than just showing up every weekend. So if you ask the, like, what do I do now question, the member class is your answer. And so I went through it last time. You'll notice that there's a little piece of paper that's hanging up that tells you some of the new members that we're going to celebrate during our Celebration Sunday. You might also notice that one of those names may sound strangely familiar, right? And so I've been vetted deeply, but I want you to know that I get to be a new member here too. Hey, that's going to be fun. All right, yeah. I could have skipped on that, but I was like, let's go ahead and let's do it. Let me see the whole thing. And you may say, like, what do I do now? Because I've been attending for a while. The member class will answer all of that. And what does it mean to be a member here? And what commitment does that make? And so those are easy, like two really easy ways to say, if I'm a part of Harbor Trinity, what's the best way for me to define what it means to follow? Those are the two. And that needs to be true of every place that you go to, but specifically here as we look to what does it mean to rebuild? Alpha is a place for us to say, man, Harbor Trinity is a safe place to explore faith. It's a safe place to find and follow Jesus. And the other part about it is that Harbor Trinity is a place that, yes, you can show up every week, but we also can together commit ourselves to say, what could God do if we made this commitment together? Those are those two places, and so that's how it begins. And then as we fast forward, so I know we've got a bit of skipping because we tried to compile some chapters and some themes in weeks before, but as all this starts to play out, you could say, like, what was the response of the people? Because they said, hey, we're going to give the first of everything we have, we're going to give that to God. All of this we're going to dedicate. We're going to give more than what we're asking of our first. We're going to make sure that this maintains. You'll notice that there was a lot of like financial and agricultural commitments that they were making to see this be fulfilled. And you could say, having come out of exile and now knowing that this is the way it's going to go, like what was the response of the people? We'll put this on the screen for you. Nehemiah 12:43 is the response of the people. And it says, and they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced. For God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard from far away. So they offered sacrifices, they gave things away, and they rejoiced. God had caused there to be new joy in their rejoicing. Women and children were rejoicing. And my favorite phrase is that the joy of Jerusalem was heard from far away. So that's the second blank we've got for you. The second blank is hear joy. Hear joy. If you'll remember from Nehemiah 1, there was a report, and Nehemiah asked, how is Jerusalem? And they said it's in disrepair. The walls are broken down. The gates are destroyed. There's been fire. The people are living in great shame and anxiety. And if you fast forward a couple of chapters, it says that this disrepair and shame has been turned to joy. A phrase that you'll hear, it often comes up in song a lot, but one of the phrases that comes from the Bible is that God takes our mourning and he turns it into dancing. He takes our sorrow and he brings it into great joy. This is the picture of that. Because this people that had been the shame of the other nations has now, other nations are hearing from far away joy. Now, I don't know if you've ever shown up somewhere so fun that you could hear it from the outside, right? But what does it do to your heart when you hear that level of joy? It makes you want to go inside, right? It's not that part where you're like, man, they seem like they're having such a great time. I don't think I should go. Like there's this part of your heart that's like, let me see a little bit. Maybe it's too wild that I don't want to go in there. But everything about joy makes you want to be a participator of it. And we find like one of my key indicators of joy in my life is, am I singing or not? And I know that may be odd to you because I'm not a singer. You'll never catch me up here singing, right? They won't even give me a muted mic to be able to sing along just to be a participant. It's not going to happen because there's not, apparently I don't know how to sing on key. That's to be determined. I feel like I'm doing great, right? But one of the things that I recognize is when there's joy like inside of my life, just songs come out. Like it's just a moment where like melodies or random things, I just find myself singing. And here's what I know about you. You find yourself singing too. And one of the like real like indicators of our life is there something that's pouring out of us? And some of the state of our lives could be, there's just not this thing that's flowing out. And in Jerusalem, as the walls had been rebuilt, as the temple had been reestablished, as the covenant had been recommitted, as God had shown that he was faithful to do all the things that he said, all of a sudden, there was brand new joy. That this is the Bible's equivalent of they threw a citywide block party. And it was just joy to be heard from everybody because of God's faithfulness. And one of the things that I've experienced inside of church culture, and one of the things that I consistently want to poke against, is we at times culturally can struggle with joy. Right? That it's one of those things that can be hard for us to even like functionally do. And even inside of services, sometimes it can be hard. Right, so a person can come up here and lead worship, and you can have Shane be the person who's leading, right? And there's moments where Shane could be up here, and he would be like strumming along on his guitar, and he's like, all right, everybody, let's like clap our hands. And people are like, yeah, like we'll clap, right? And then he could be like, let's shout for joy. But that's the part where you shout. Any shouters? Oh, okay. That didn't work, you guys. We're going to move on. And so that's what happens, right? Because there's something where it feels kind of awkward. Right? I've been a part of church services where they're like, hey, let's start to dance a little bit. And then if you've ever been a part of a place where there's dance, there's sometimes where like each culture has its own rhythm, and I'm not talking like culture outside of church culture. Every church has its way of getting down, right? So there's times where it's like, hey, let's start to dance a little bit. I can tell you, those of us who find ourselves of the Caucasian persuasion, I can tell you usually the way it's going to go down if dancing is involved in a church like ours. I can tell you one of the first ways it's going to go. It's going to be this move. This is it. Like, this is the way, hey, let's start to dance, right? Let's do this. I want to ask the question, name another environment in your life where you would be like, hey, you guys, we're going to start to dance, and you're like, oh, yeah, look at my move, right? Now, some of you may say, like, I'm going to play the movie Hitch, right, where this is going to be my dance move. Like, I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to get crazy. I'm not going to make any pizzas. I'm not going to be a lighthouse. I'm just going to stay in my lane. Maybe that's you. But here's what I know about you. You will catch a groove, and you will start to dance. Because that's an appropriate expression of joy. Find some other places where dance as an expression of joy is happening, and you'll find some people who get down, right? Like there's times where like, I don't know if you're going to show up and do a gritty when you walk in, but you'll find some people who are like finding their flavorful expression. When joy starts to become a part of the house, man, it just starts to flow out of us. And here's what I'll tell you. If your joy move is this, get down what you get down. Right? Because we all got to start somewhere. But when joy starts to be a part of the house, man, there's something about, there's a reason for us to celebrate. And I want to tell you, at our church, we have reasons to celebrate. And we'll throw this thing up where we'll have like celebration Sundays coming up on April 2nd. And one of the things that's a trap about a title is that we could say like it's just, yay, celebration Sunday, right? Like, yes, and there's things that are worth celebrating. So I'll lay it out for you. Jamie did a great job during announcements, but we'll kick it back. At 8:30 to 10 o'clock, we're doing a fundraiser that's involving pancakes. Food's fun for everybody, and there's bacon. Hey-o. But what's a reason for us to celebrate 8:30 to 10 o'clock? Part of the reason for us to celebrate is there's groups of teenagers that we're going to send up to a camp where every one of them, our hope for all of them is that they're going to find and follow Jesus in a better way. And does buying pancakes, is pancakes my preferred? I'm more of a bagel guy. But am I going to eat all that I can for pancakes on that day to support as many teenagers as I can? Yes, I will. Will I also sneak some other pieces of bacon just because I think it's delicious? Yes. But why is there a reason for us to be joyful? Because of everything that people would say about teenagers and the next generation today. In this house, we've got a group of them who are choosing to find and follow Jesus, and we get to support them in doing that. In the same way that someone supported you. So part of the reason we get to celebrate and show up early at 8:30 is because there's breakfast that's only going to cost us $5, but the $5 is really far more than just getting pancakes. It's our investment into a group of teenagers to say we believe in you and all that you hope and expect to come in this summer as you go up to Hume. Our hope and belief and our prayer is that we're sending it with you, that you would do all that God is hoping you to do. That's part of the reason why we celebrate. And then as we enter into a service, we're going to have teenagers who are going to be leading in worship. We're going to have teenagers who are speaking and sharing messages as a follow-up from their mission trip. So you're going to have a chance to hear from the next generation. And we're going to celebrate that. We've got people who are being baptized on that weekend, people who are publicly professing what God has been doing in their life. They're going to have a public profession of it, and we get to celebrate that. We have people who are committing to being members of this church and saying in this new chapter, we are signing up for all that God has ahead of this church. All of that is reason to celebrate. And I want to prepare your heart for it because most of the time we're like golf fans when we celebrate, right? Someone got baptized. Yay, he made the putt, right? Like I want to encourage your football, right? I want to encourage this like football part of your heart to come out in terms of celebration because you know what never happens on a touchdown? Yeah. Oh, the Rams scored, hooray. Like they're, all right, so already you got 2 weeks to prepare. Start working your heart because this is going to be a part of how do we step that up, right? So that part's there. As we approach Good Friday and we get to remember the death of Jesus, right? And we're even going to allow our hearts to sit in God himself was crucified for us. There's reason to celebrate in that. And then we celebrate that he is risen from the tomb and that every one of us gets a brand new life because of that resurrection. And there's reason to celebrate and there is reason for us to rejoice. And so, yes, this little card is just a card that we can hang on our fridge, but also included in this little card is the belief of all that God has done in your life and our belief and expectation that if God has done it at us, he can do for everybody. So every one of these cards being passed out is a prayer and a hope that God would do it again. And that's how we point our hearts towards celebrating. And it also helps when we gather up eggs and have carnival games and we've got breakfast and, pancakes before and we get to have hot dogs and chips after. Let's go. All right, so all of that's enough. Let's finish Nehemiah 13. All right, Nehemiah 13, and then you'll flip over. This is how we'll end. There are some people who are prone or who wake up and choose violence who love Nehemiah 13, right? Because it's about to go down, right? So we'll catch up. Here's Nehemiah 13, and then I have to land this plane so aggressively quick. Somebody brought in bags today and are like, the sermons are getting kind of long, Justin. I've got lunch prepared. I was like, easy, shots fired. All right, here we go. Nehemiah 13. So on that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now before this, Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chamber of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandments to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked for leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the outer courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the temple, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each other to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites as their assistant Hanan the son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, for they had considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they had brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day which they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and in all kinds of good and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you're bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. After I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day, then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, "Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you." That's a good time. For that time when they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. Yikes. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves." Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sit on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I cleansed them in everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and the Levites, each in his work, and I provided for them the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. So here's the last blank we've got for you as we finish out our series together. The last blank is this: remember. And what's interesting is if you were to read along through this, you'll notice that there's a couple of parts where it seems like really quickly everybody forgot. Like all of these things that Nehemiah got heated about were all things that they said just a couple of chapters ago. We commit, we will do it. Here we go. And then Nehemiah leaves. And so the easiest way for us to say it is he goes back to the King Artaxerxes. It's about a 2-month travel there. And then as he's there, the assumption is that he didn't just show up and say, "Hey, I know I'm back after this 12-year absence, but I got to go back again. The work's going to take longer. Can you pay for my trip back?" Stays, serves, provides an update. So let's just assume it's 6 months, right? 2 months there, 2 months waiting, 2 months back, maybe longer. But even if 6 months is our best case scenario, in 6 months, it's all fallen apart. That as they said, hey, we're going to make sure that the house of God is taken care of, that it's going to be holy. Next thing you know, Tobiah built himself a house inside of God's house. So Nehemiah shows up and is like, "You got Tobiah a room? The guy who tried to kill me, the guy who called me out into the field, the guy who was chasing me down, you made a room for Tobiah?" And he goes and throws all of his stuff out. Right? We've all seen the moments where somebody's getting thrown out of their house. Tobiah's getting thrown. Right? So they're just throwing all of his stuff out of his house. Now Nehemiah's taking a breath. Whoo, right? He's rubbing his earlobes woosah, I got to calm down on this real quick. And then he's like, "Hold up. There's been some marriages since I've been gone." And he's like, "Look at all these marriages. You said you weren't going to marry all these different peoples. Why are you marrying all these different? You said you weren't going to do that. Why are you doing that?" So he starts having a conversation about that. And one of the things that it's so subtle when he says it, but he's like, you've got these group of Hebrews that have married people from these other nations, and it says that the children no longer spoke Hebrew anymore, but they spoke the language of the nations. And some of that is both reflective of the house of their culture, some of that is the way that things interact, but some of that is so reflective of the person we choose to marry, and the way we give ourselves in relationships is going to carry to every aspect of our life. And if we don't preserve our closest relationships and our closest pursuit of God, then other things are going to have a dramatic influence. But he's like, you said you weren't going to do that. So he's got that portion of it. Then he starts to say, hey, you promised you were going to prepare for the house of God. You said that you were going to set aside things. Everything's fallen in disrepair. Like, we just built this house. And you're letting it, like, get all the paint starting to corrode. Like, what are you doing? So he starts to bring people back from that. Then they're working on the Sabbath. He shows up and he's like, what is going on? Like, we said we were going to close it. So what does he do? He locks all of the doors before the sun goes down. And he's like, doors aren't opening until the sun comes up the next day. Right? And then he starts to say that if you want to test me, like, you're going to catch these hands. Right? Which, if you don't know, like, those are fighting words. Like, he said, I will put my hands on you. That's not a gentle, like, hey, like, nice. Like, you need to know the hands language. And he's like, I will fight you if you try to open this up. Then we start to see further down the line that he's like, get everybody in here. He's like grabbing people by their beards. Ooh. Right? If you're the guy that Nehemiah comes back into town, he's like, right? Like, and then it's like, whoo, it's coming in hot. And what's crazy to me is he has this moment where he's like, remember me, God, remember me, God, remember the work that I commissioned, God. But included in this is for you and I to remember. Because our heart is prone to wander. It's prone to leave the one I love. But here's my heart, Lord. Take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. Like, we just sang that one. And yet there's so much that's so true that if we're not careful, our heart's going to wander. And look how quickly it does. For them, it's, man, we're 6 months into returning from exile. We're just a couple of days into reestablishing what God had committed. And yet here we are giving it away. And there's a charge for you and I. Not only to remember the things that God has done, but allow our hearts to be sealed in his doing of it. And so for some of us, it's to remember these things annually and to say to ourselves, here's the day where I found and I followed Jesus. Here's the day where I was baptized. Here's the day where I was married. Here's the day where God has continued to seal. For some of us, it's we need to write down the things that God is doing and saying so that we don't forget. Whatever your rhythm is, whatever your cadence is, however you find to do it, there's got to be a way that you allow yourself to remember. Because when times get hard, you'll be prone to forget because times are hard. And you'll forget all the ways that God carried in other hard times because all you can see is the hard time in front of you. And there's other moments when times get stale or when times get boring and you find yourself forgetting. And so you'll not remember the ways in which God has carried you out of times like that before. And if we don't remember, we'll forget. And the charge for the last chapter of Nehemiah is remember. Remember who you are. Remember what God has done. Remember how God has carried. And the thing for you and I, as we look ourselves ahead, is for us to remember. Because for 70 years, God has been remembering like this little part of Costa Mesa. God has remembered this church and this sanctuary and that chapel and these people and these members. God has remembered the work of these hands. And so when we enter into our own brand new chapter, we don't say we have no idea what's in front of it. We know everything that's in front of it. God will be faithful again. God will do what he said. And so we commit our hands to his work and we say, God, would you do again all that you've been doing before? And God, if there's a desire for you to do far and above, we just open our hands to far and above too. But we open our hands to say, we trust you, God, and we're going to follow. That's our way to remember. And as we consistently point back and say, remember when, it's going to help us for all our days ahead as we look forward. And we're going to have a chance even to commission that today as we worship together. So let's do this. Can we bow our head and close our eyes? Not because there's something sacred in the posture, but it's a way for us, even today, to remember. And there are some of you who have come today, whether it's the invitation of a friend or it's a, passing by on the sign, but this is your first time being a part of Harbor Trinity, or maybe it's your first time to a church, or maybe it's first time, long time. But there's a part of today where even in your own arrival today, there's something that God is doing in your life that you're saying, I want to find Jesus either for the first time or I'm making the decision to follow him again. And so here would be my request. If that's you today, if you're someone who's saying, I want to say yes to following Jesus, I want to say yes to knowing more about Jesus, could you lift your hand up real high? Because I'd love the opportunity to pray with you. You're either making a comeback today or you're saying yes. Yeah, thank you so much for lifting your hands up. Yeah, thank you so much for lifting your hands up. The thing that's so encouraging every week to those of you who lift your hands is we remember that there was a group of people who had this as a prayer and a hope. And what you need to know is there's a group of people today who have that same prayer and who have that same hope. And here's our desire from you. You see this little information card that's in your bulletin. You can tear off that. There's a portion of this that says, I accepted Christ as my Savior today. If you check that, we've got a next steps guide for you out at the welcome tent. That's an easy way to follow up. But also by filling this out, I'll have a chance to follow up with you tomorrow and tell you some of the really exciting next steps that we have ahead. And in a moment, we're going to take a chance to pray together. Here's the other two that I'm not going to ask anybody else to lift up their hand, but it's going to be a moment for each of us to respond. The second place is if there's space in your heart for joy to be heard. Maybe it's the decision to be baptized that you haven't done yet. Maybe it's the decision to become a member at Harbor Trinity, which you haven't done yet. Maybe there's something that God is doing and working in your life. And maybe it's your own transition that I need to start moving my heart away from being a golf fan when it comes to what God is doing. And I need to move my heart towards football. I need to start letting more joy come out of my mouth. I need to let more joy start to come out of my song. I need to let some rhythm start to get into my feet and into my hips. And I need to let dancing start to arise as I remember the things that God has done. Maybe there's just a joy that's starting to churn on the inside. I'm going to pray that over each of you. And then for all of us to remember personally in your life as you met, found, and followed Jesus, to remember the ways that God has been faithful up until this point into your life. And no matter where you find yourself, to remember that if God has been faithful thus far, that surely he's going to continue to be faithful for the days ahead. Let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank you so much that as we open our hands, as we open our hearts, as we even open in prayer, there's a moment today, God, where we're reminding ourselves that the God of the universe, when he looked at our world and even looked at our lives and saw the ways that we had separated ourselves from you or our own shortcomings or issues, you didn't look down upon us and say, fix that yourselves, but you put on human flesh. You lived a perfect, sinless human life, and you suffered in our place upon that cross. And you did so to take all of our sin and all of our shortcoming. And so, God, even in this moment, whether we were saying yes to you for the very first time or even this moment, God, we're having our own opportunity to confess, God, we lay our sins upon your cross and we trust that the death of Jesus is enough to wash away every sin. But we also believe that the resurrection of Jesus is powerful enough that as you called yourself to walk out of that tomb alive, it's the promise that every one of us can have a new life. And I pray that, God, for those who are accepting that new life today for the first time, those who are recommitting to a new life today, or God, those who are walking out in accordance with Shane's prayer different today, God, would you help us to experience the resurrected life of Jesus? Would it bring new joy inside of our lives? Would there be new smiles and new songs and new dance moves and new celebrations and new testimonies that would start to pour forth? Would the joy of Harbor Trinity be heard from afar? And not simply because we have speakers on the outside that can make it to the neighbors, but would you let the joy on the inside extend far beyond any of our gathering times? Would you let the joy of our home start to pour forth in the lives of our neighbors? And would we be people, God, who remember? As much as our heart is prone to forget, God, would you take and seal our hearts to remember you, God? And not to forget. In our darkest days, God, would we remember? In our dullest days, God, would we remember? In the days where everything is far better than we imagined, God, would we remember? And would you remember us, oh God, for our good? And it's into your hands we commit ourselves. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's stand and sing together.
I will exalt you. treasure, Lord, you are my friend and King, anointed one, most holy. Because you're with me, because you're with me, because you're with me, I will not fear. Because you're with me, because you're with me, because you're with me, because you're with me, I will not fear. My hiding place, my hiding place, my safe refuge, my treasure, Lord, you are my friend and King, anointed one, most holy, my hiding place, my safe refuge, my treasure, Lord, you are my friend and King, anointed one, most holy. I will exalt you. I will exalt you. I will exalt you. You are my God. I will exalt you. I will exalt you. I will exalt you. You are my God, my hiding place, my safe refuge, my treasure, Lord, you are my friend and King, anointed one, most holy. Would you pray with me? God, thank you so much. There are not enough words to tell you what for. I ask that today as we leave here, God, that we would have no choice but to remember that in everything we do and say, that we exalt you, that we remember the promises that we've made to you and you to us, and that those, not our own desires, not our interests, but those are what guide us. You are greater than all the wants. And you know all of our needs. There is nothing bigger, better, or stronger than you. And I pray that none of us forget.